the forces of hate and fear have wreaked their havoc, it is already too late. By the time American Airlines Flight 11 and United Airlines Flight 175 fly one after another into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, it is already too late. By the time the new visitor to Wednesday night Bible study says, "You rape our women and you're taking over our country," and opens fire on the pastor and 8 others gathered there. By the time 3 Israeli teenagers hitchhiking home are kidnapped and found murdered, and the day after their funerals, a young Palestinian teenager is kidnapped and murdered in retaliation, it's already too late. You know the all too familiar litany. By the time the school goes into lockdown, by the time the bomb goes off at the rally. And on that score, our hearts go out to our Turkish colleagues and hosts tonight in the aftermath of the horrific bombing of a Kurdish peace rally last week in August. Let's be realistic and clear. In the moment and over the short term, so much of this havoc is beyond our control. By the time it happens, it's already too late. So what then do we do? We go after the bad guys. We do whatever it takes to make sure this never happens again, even if it means there is collateral damage. Even if it means the cycle of hate and fear continues. And so the question before us tonight is this the antidote to extremism? That is a question. At least in the short term, maybe, maybe not. But what about over the long haul? As devastating and tragic as these manifestations of hate and fear are, there is something more dire and more ominous about extremism. More threatening and far-reaching than the worst that any murderer or terrorist or armada of evil can do. My friends, it is when extremism moves from the margins to the center. When extremism moves from the margins to the center. When that happens, extremism can poison the well of our entire society. It can drive a wedge between people of goodwill. It can pit us against each other. In the words of the poet Yeats, things fall apart. The center cannot hold. When hate and fear becomes the order of the day, we resort to dividing up the world into us and them. Respect for differences morphs into self-righteous intolerance. Sacrifice for the common good is replaced by rabid self-interest. Most terrifying is when those victimized by extremism unwittingly become proponents of the same blinding untruths and perpetrators of equally inhumane behavior. Given that all that can be done in the name of extremism, this is the worst of all possible outcomes. And perhaps you might share my feeling tonight that our current situation is coming too close to such a state of affairs for comfort. But having reached the worst of all that is seemingly beyond our control, we get a sense of what our response can be. Even in the face of extremism at its worst, we can decide not to let it bring out the worst in us. for how we respond to extremism and respond together is within our control. There's a funny little story about tourists in a rental car exploring the back roads of Scotland who find themselves lost. So they stop by the side of the road to ask a farmer for directions. What is the best way back to Antidote? The farmer thought for a moment. He looked down the road this way. He looked down the road that way. My best advice is to start from somewhere other than here. In this most frightening of times in our nation and in our world, where there appears only to be polarization and no center to hold us together, what is the best way back to sanity, to civility, to the common good? How do we start from somewhere other than here? Well, for starters, we can change the way we talk about it. At the margins, there has always been and will always be disparagement of the other, demagoguery, and hate speech. But the alarm should go off when that kind of rhetoric becomes more acceptable in the mainstream of public discourse. Surely as a nation, we can consider the appropriate need to govern our borders and to employ an orderly process for those who want to become U.S. citizens without demonizing those who are already here and those who want to come here in the future. Without naming names, we've heard a leading candidate for president play on the anxieties of a silent majority of Americans who are afraid of losing our country, using over and over and over again the same unquestionably horrific but singular anecdote of the brutalization and murder of a woman in San Francisco by a criminal from Mexico who came to the United States illegally. By using this anecdote over and over again, this candidate has impugned the character and motives of the Mexican people in general. And this kind of rhetoric has threatened to set the tone for the current debate on immigration. By the way, this same unnamed candidate said, "My grandparents didn't come to America all the way from Germany to see it taken over by immigrants." My point is this: advocate for whatever immigration policy you want, no problem. But do you have to demonize an entire people in the process? Surely we can distinguish between the marauding, murderous bands of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram from the Muslim family that has recently moved in down the street. The Muslim family who attends Jumu'ah prayer at noon on Friday at the mosque across town. The Muslim parents who are teaching their children not to hate and fear, but to live a morally disciplined and peaceful, loving life, as Allah, gracious and merciful, would have them live. As recently argued in an editorial in the Chicago Tribune, the common assumption is that Muslims are not only monolithic, but united behind the most extreme and violent members of their religion. A presidential candidate who will not be named voiced that sentiment when he told an interviewer it wasn't people from Sweden who blew up the World Trade Center. No, And it wasn't people from Iran or Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia who blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City in 1995, or killed 5 people with anthrax-laced letters in 2001, or assassinated a Kansas abortion doctor in 2009. Every religion has its radical elements, Islam included, but the great majority of Muslims here and abroad do not endorse or engage in violence. 8 out of 10 American Muslims say violence against civilians in defense of Islam is never justified. By all means, friends, let us join together with the overwhelming majority of 6 million American Muslims and the 1.2 billion Muslims around the world in decrying the acts of terrorism and violence done falsely in the name of Islam. But there is no need to demonize our Muslim neighbors and slander Islam in the process. I do have to admit, however, how easy it is for a negative stereotype or a prejudicial view of others and sneak in. A number of years ago, I attended the annual meeting of the Kentucky Council of Churches to speak about fostering dialogue and cooperation between diverse religious communities. Standing in line for lunch one day, I found myself among a group of pastors and other educators who did ecumenical and interreligious work across the state. We were all clearly liberal, politically and theologically, coming from mainline Protestant denominations, Methodist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, United Church of Christ, Episcopalian. There might have been a Unitarian in our midst. One of the local pastors engaged in this kind of work lived in a small town with 7 churches. He told us that each of the churches had made a decision to host a refugee family. The Southern Baptist Church ended up hosting a family from Cambodia. With a smile, he said, "Of course, the family from Cambodia are all Buddhists. It's interesting to watch those Southern Baptists learn that Buddhists are human beings." Being liberal types, we all smiled and nodded our heads. This was a good lesson for the Southern Baptists, but he was setting us up. He went on to say, "Just as interesting is that the rest of us are learning the same thing about Southern Baptists." One way or another, none of us is immune. We all have this tendency to divide the world up into us and them. It takes a never-ending vigilance and discipline to see the humanity in others, regardless of sex, age, race, ethnicity, nationality, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, economic status, social standing, religious affiliation, or political opinion. To see the humanity in a young woman who decides to terminate an unwanted pregnancy in the hopes that at a future date she will be in a better position to more responsibly care for the precious life of a child. To see the humanity in a couple that decides to give birth to a child whose deformities mean only days or weeks of inevitably difficult and short-lived, but nevertheless precious life. To see the humanity in the pacifist who welcomes home the soldier from the war the pacifists opposed. And to see the humanity in that same soldier who felt called by her country to defend the pacifist freedom to oppose that war. Yes, there is a kind of ambiguity in these decisions and stances, But I think you feel with me, there is also a kind of certainty as well. From an extremist perspective, it is difficult, if not impossible, to hold the ambiguity and the certainty together. But if we want to avoid the pitfalls of extremism, we must and can hold them together. And in doing so, we hold on to our humanity and our ability to see the humanity in others. In order to do that, we must not confuse the right to hold our own convictions with the claim that others must see it our way. You and I can imagine a person who is firm in their convictions, but open-minded, who thinks for himself or herself, but is willing to consider others' points of view. A person who wants their own voice to be heard and to be taken seriously, but makes room for the voices of others as well. A person for whom there are ideals for which they would sacrifice, even give their own life, but not insist that others have to do the same. Such a person affirms the freedom of others to think, to act, and to live differently. It strikes me this is one reason why Pope Francis was so well received during his recent visit to the United States. Firm in his Catholic convictions, no doubt, yet open to others who did not share his convictions, both non-Catholics and Catholics alike. By the way, again, not to name names, but one media critic put his frustrations with the Holy Father this way. Who the hell does the Pope think he is? He's going around acting as if he's Jesus. Likewise, you can imagine the person who is firm in their convictions, but not open to other points of view. A person that does not believe others are entitled to their own beliefs or to live their lives in their own way. This is what most of us mean when we use the word extremist. It is their way or the highway. And in their effort to impose their worldview on the rest of us, the extremists may resort to all kinds of things to get their way, inflicting enormous damage along the way. Though over the short term, the extremists may get their way. Over the long haul, in terms of winning over the hearts and minds of their fellow citizens, of their fellow human beings, they will never succeed. Because a person convinced against their will is not convinced. Only a person freely persuaded. And this is why persuasion, rather than coercion, is at the same time the most powerless and the most powerful force in the world. Which brings us to the most difficult part of the journey, from a polarized and breaking apart world to a place of healing and of getting along. The monumental task of letting go in order to move forward, of ending the vicious cycle of hate and fear with us, and starting a more virtuous cycle of understanding and respect for those who come after us. Needless to say, that's a tall order. To let go of justifiable anger, to forgive the unspeakable, to work on behalf of the well-being of those who have wished you ill, requires enormous courage, strength, and resolve. No wonder this heroic spiritual struggle is a chief preoccupation of all the world's religions. God only knows we need all the help we can get when it comes to letting go and moving on. But that's what so many at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina have decided to do. In the wake of the shooting of their pastor and 8 members of the congregation by alleged shooter Dylan. As reported in the Washington Post, the relatives of people slain were able to speak directly to the accused gunman at his first court hearing. One by one, those who chose to speak at the bond hearing did not turn to anger. Instead, while the shooter remained impassive, they offered him forgiveness and said they were praying for his soul, even as they described the pain of their losses. I forgive you, Nadine Collier, the daughter of 70-year-old Ethel Lance, said at the hearing, her voice breaking with emotion. You took something very precious from me. I will never talk to her again. I will never, ever hold her again. But I forgive you. And God have mercy on your soul. Here's a thought experiment for you. Imagine for the moment that the world is overrun by a terrible plague of global proportions, threatening the human race with extinction. Millions are dying, and millions more are gripped in fear and despair. In the ensuing chaos, people are taking sides. People are at each other's throats. Imagine now that those of us here in this room tonight had the formula for the enemy. Of course, we would have to use it. Of course, we would have to share it with the world. When it comes to extremism, we can take the worst this epidemic can throw at us, and with the best we have in us, transform it into something new. We can work to lessen the conditions that create extremism in the first place. We can stand in solidarity with and care for those who suffer because of it. We can work to create the conditions that transform fear into understanding and hate into respect. Most crucially, we can focus on the next generation. Yes, hate and fear is passed from generation to generation, yet the opposite is also true. My father's generation did not have to battle the derogatory stereotypes of Italian immigrants as wops and dirty dagos and mafia gangsters that his parents, my grandparents, who passed through El Asylum, had to endure. I was not burdened with the racial stereotypes of African Americans that my parents' generation carried. My 2 sons, for them, Islamophobia is bad. Through the efforts of the present generation, the vicious cycle of hate and fear can be slowed or stopped or even turned around. If you've got to be taught to hate and fear, you can also be taught to love and respect. And when it comes to the next generation, it's never too late. So let me end with this story. Ihab Khatib was a rock-throwing Palestinian youth during the first Intifada in the early 1990s. In his encounter with Israeli soldiers, he was beaten so badly that instead of being hauled off to prison, he ended up in a hospital. The only silver lining to this was that it enabled Ihab to leave the region. He was able to go and study abroad. He worked for the United Nations and then for relief and development organizations internationally. He has since returned to his troubled land to work in partnership with a young Israeli Lior Frankenstein. Together, Ihab and Lior are introducing young and upcoming Israeli and Palestinian politicians, diplomats, and government officials to each other, building a sense of trust between them and giving them the skills to navigate the contentious relationship between their two peoples. Over dinner at a restaurant in East Jerusalem, where Ihab now lives with his wife and 2 children, he told me this story. In Israel, each day there is a national day of remembrance. At noon on that day, sirens go off in Jerusalem and across the country. Israelis stop, stand, and observe a moment of silence in memory of the Holocaust. Ihab can afford to send his children to a private school where the teachers are Israeli. On the most recent day of remembrance, he asked his 13-year-old daughter, "Did you hear the siren today? Did you know what it means? Did your teacher stand for a moment of silence? Did you stand with her?" His daughter said, "I thought about it, but I did not stand. I know the Jewish people have suffered, but we have suffered too. When Israelis stand with Palestinians in our suffering, then I will stand with them in theirs." Ihab told his daughter that he understood what she was saying and that she had made a wise decision. Later, Ihab asked his 8-year-old son the same question. His son said, "Of course I stood. You have to remember that people suffered and died. You have to stand with them no matter who they are." Ihab told his son that he understood what he was saying and that he had made a wise decision. A lot of wisdom there, is there not? With the daughter, with the son, with the father. My friends, how can we make this kind of wisdom mainstream?